welcome everyone. So thanks for joining us for this fourth session where we will tackle the topic of the integration of biodiversity in finance and investments. Today's session is the fourth session of a series of public policy fora, which are co-organized by the Brussels School of Governance of VUB. So that's its research center on the environment, economy and energy, and then in partnership with Open Universiteit Netherlands in its environmental science department. So we, in this session, have been focusing on to discuss the integration of the new biodiversity frameworks in economic policies with the participation of distinguished experts. This initiative is funded by the European basically a union and organized as part of the Jean Monnet Chair Ecovalence. So in today's session, we will focus on how nature-related risks and opportunities can be better integrated in the financial systems and by investors, and what are the regulatory and market initiatives that are needed to address the financing of activities that have adverse impact on nature, how to best support transition, but also meet some of the funding gaps which are needed for the transition and the EU Green Deal in particular to establish a sustainable economy. So here I just quote some numbers from a UNEP FI study on the state of finance for nature that highlights the needs actually to triple the amount of money that goes into nature-based solutions for this decade. But actually another important number that attracted my attention is that actually less than 20% of the funding today that goes into nature-based solutions comes actually from the private sector. It's mainly publicly funded. So now we have, as part of the coming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, specific targets which have been set and defined for the corporate and financial sector, in particular the target 15 that calls for business and financial institutions to take specific actions. So today, in this session, actually, we'll deep dive into how can this nature risk be better assessed and acted upon by the financial sectors and invested industries. Is it what has been put in place or in the plan sufficient? And if not, how to make it work? So to tackle the topic of today, we'll have actually 4 speakers who will be in order. Sébastien Godino, who is an economist at the WWF European Policy Office, will provide us with a starting overview of the key regulation and initiatives in the pipeline or existing, and then followed by Marianne Haar, who is TNFD and Nature Finance Lead at Global Canopy, will take us actually through what's happening with this task force for nature-related financial disclosure, which is a initiative which is a prominent initiative. We also have the pleasure then to have Jessica Smith as a third speaker, who is a nature lead at the United Nations Environmental Program FI, financial institutions. So that's a UN-convened network of banks, insurers and investors to accelerate sustainable development, and in particular with a focus on the environment. She will be able to talk us through some key initiatives and what's happening with their membership and the financial industry. And then as the 4 speakers, we have Arno Klug, who is the Director of Biodiversity Research at MSCI, and will take us through the main development in terms of data and analytics on biodiversity and how to best support the financial sector to evolve and transition. After those 4 presentations, so we will have a discussion with a panel, an open discussion on what are the main challenges and opportunities that they see to move forward. And then at the end, we will open the questions to the participants in the room and also those who have been joining online. And this meeting is being recorded until the open discussion. So on this, Sébastien, I will invite you to start with your presentation.
You uploaded it, or?
Yes, it's uploaded, so you can maybe.
Is the right slide?
Yes, that looks like mine.
Oh, okay.
So, hi everybody, my name is Sebastian Godino, I'm with WWF, the Open Policy Office, I'm based in Brussels, and I'm senior economist heading our team on sustainable finance. I'll give you an overview of the different EU functional policies and regulations that can relate to biodiversity, finance and corporate regulation partly, can relate, but that's not necessarily only biodiversity focused. So I counted 10 different relevant EU files, which sounds like a lot. Some are already finalized and entering into application, etc., or some are ongoing and still being negotiated by EU policymakers. So I'll briefly go through each of them. One of the most famous. Is it okay?
There's just one problem because people online, they cannot see the changed slides. So let me just, I'm sorry for the inconvenience. I think we just need to share the right window again.
Yeah, that would be the second one from the top. Yeah, above. Yeah, that one.
That one below.
Oh yeah, this one.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you.
Is it fine now?
Yeah.
Good.
I'm sorry for the inconvenience.
So first one is so-called SFDR, Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulations. So that's a disclosure requirement for investors only. Importantly, it builds on the double materiality approach, which means reporting is required both on the financial impacts of biodiversity or sustainability issues for the investors, but also the investors' impact on biodiversity damage or protection. So risks and impacts. It is both at portfolio level for investors and at fund level. So it's pretty granular and it includes quite a few reporting requirements on sustainability issues, including green taxonomy alignment, principal adverse impacts, degree of alignment with the Climate Paris Agreement, the sustainability category of sustainable funds, etc. So there's quite a lot in this regulation. Another one, less famous, is the benchmark regulation, which includes, since 2 years, some requirements for financial index providers to disclose sustainability information at index level. That can include some biodiversity elements if some are taken into account in a specific index. Another one is the EU Green Bond Standard that was very recently finalized. It's a label for green bonds that green bond issuers can decide to use. As for any label, it's voluntary. So that means the green bond issuer can decide to use it and then has to comply with certain obligations. And it includes especially sustainability reporting on the use of proceeds, which means how the money raised with the green bond on the capital market is spent by the green bond issuer. Another one is called MiFID and IDD. These are in fact two different files on distribution processes on the market for different funds. So it is really at fund level, and in something it's benefiting retail investors. It's you and me investing a bit of our own money, so not institutional investors. And in the so-called suitability assessment process, when the retail investors want to invest money in a fund, it has to select and buy a given fund. You have thousands of funds on the market, so the person goes to the functional advisor, usually in a bank, but can be elsewhere. And the functional advisor is now required by these two laws to ask the sustainability preferences of the retail investor and act upon it in terms of adapting the offer of financial products to this retail investor. And the retail investor can raise biodiversity issues or ecosystems elements in terms of not damaging ecosystems or specific protection or biodiversity friendly sectors, etc. But it's up to the retail investor to raise it upfront. Other ongoing files, which means they are not finalized yet. They are still being negotiated at EU level by policymakers, Commission, Parliament, and Council. A very important one, actually a foundational one for corporate reporting, is called CSRD, Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. The directive itself was finalized last year with a slow entry into implementation until 2028, depending on the size of the company. It concerns all companies above 250 staff. That's around 50,000 companies in the EU market, plus listed SMEs. It's too small, very small, 2,000 companies only, but also very importantly, around 10,000 foreign companies, which comply with the thresholds at the level of the EU companies. So typically, if a large US or UK company has a subsidiary in the EU market, this EU subsidiary will have to comply with this regulation for its EU activities. And it's also having a double materiality approach, both sustainability-related risks for the company itself and also impacts on people and planet from the company. And importantly, it's still ongoing because there is a forthcoming standard that will specify how this file should be implemented by companies, providing much more granularity in terms of key performance indicators that the companies will have to use as a template for their sustainability reporting. And there is something specific on biodiversity and nature and ecosystems. Next one is the EU taxonomy. Once again, here, the regulation was finalized in 2020, but there are different delegated acts which are implementing regulation to specify how the taxonomy is put into practice with sector-specific criteria. And there's currently, the Commission is currently reviewing criteria for adopting a new delegated act that will add new criteria for new economic activities, including for biodiversity protection, which is something new. Until now, the taxonomy was focusing only on climate change, mitigation, and adaptation. So there's something coming with a mixed quality of criteria. It's not perfect. Another ongoing file, which is extremely important, with a plenary vote in next week, or this week, sorry, is called CSDDD in the jargon, is a file on corporate due diligence on human rights and sustainability issues that might be finalized by the end of this year or early next year. It might be for companies above 500 staff, and it is requiring these companies in the scope to set up a due diligence process internally to identify and manage their impacts on sustainability, which can be on climate, on biodiversity, on human rights, on governance, etc. So it's not a double materiality, it's really the environmental and social materiality, requiring companies to identify and manage their negative impacts on sustainability issues and to enhance their positive impacts on sustainability issues. There's also a specific Article 15 on mandatory corporate targets and transition plans, but so far it only applies to climate change, not to biodiversity, which in our own view is a big flaw. There is a review clause to potentially extend this to other issues like biodiversity in a few years. Next files are two key ones called prudential rules, one for banks, one for insurers. They are still being negotiated by EU institutions. For banks, they will likely require banks to adopt a transition plans on so-called ESG, so environmental, social governance, related financial risks, including biodiversity, if this is deemed financially material. Unsurprisingly, prudential rules are really only on the financial materiality, so it's only if they are potentially sustainability-related financial risks for the bank itself, not about the bank creating negative impacts on biodiversity. And it will likely enable also banking regulators to monitor ESG risks for specific banks, potentially require banks to do or not do things on that basis. But the EU failed to amend the so-called Pillar 1 of the prudential rules, which are the capital requirements themselves, which is the most ballistic tool in this regulations. About capital requirements, this will not take directly sustainability issues like climate or biodiversity into account, at least with the current review. And the solvency file is more or less the same for insurers, although it might be a bit less ambitious, still being negotiated. So now, more generally, where do we stand now with all these files? As I mentioned initially, you think it may sound like a lot. Well, in fact, we are still far from where we should be, to be honest. We're still totally off track on our biodiversity objectives. for 2030, according to the EU biodiversity strategy adopted by the Commission, and for 2050, according to the recently adopted Global Biodiversity Framework globally, the Kunming-Montreal Agenda. Until now, most files I presented focus only on reporting that can include biodiversity where materially relevant. And even this is already under attack. The Commission is already backtracking partly with the reporting standard under CSRD, so corporate reporting. It might, in fact, make the specific biodiversity standard only voluntary for companies, even if it's considered as material by the company itself, which would be a big weakening of the proposal, the technical proposal done by an EU body. And also, this reporting, including on biodiversity by companies, is only starting. As I mentioned, for CSRD, there is a phased-in that will run until 2028. We are in 2023, so that means still half a decade to start reporting on biodiversity, which means that by 2030, it's not even sure we will have a complete, meaningful and strategic data set on biodiversity, which means that companies and financial institutions will have to take hard decisions before they have the complete data set on biodiversity. Otherwise, they will be too late and will have no chance to really contribute to the achievement of the EU 2030 biodiversity targets. And secondly, reporting is only a means to an end. Reporting in itself is not changing much, changing a little bit, but not much. This is clearly not enough to shift the market as much as we need, given the biodiversity and ecosystems collapse. There are only 3 files that go beyond reporting: retail, investors process, corporate due diligence, where companies are required to mitigate their negative impacts, and prudential rules, potentially. And it's high time we move from reporting to action, including stop doing new harm on biodiversity, also stop doing existing harm, and protect and also restore biodiversity, especially in the EU. We have weakened ecosystems so much that we cannot simply wait that they restore themselves. We need to help them to restore more quickly. And a couple of suggestions for the next Commission's and European Parliament mandate, because there will be elections next year. Very shortly, there will be a need to integrate biodiversity-related financial risks in prudential rules and also in credit ratings. Need to clarify the EU transition finance policy framework to help invest in biodiversity when companies transition to stop harming biodiversity and start protecting it. Tighten corporate due diligence to make sure companies stop doing harm. I think the slides can be shared afterwards with participants. Complete the retail finance policy to make sure retail investors asking for biodiversity-friendly funds will really be proposed something of meaningful offer by the financial advisors, and also complete corporate reporting. I put it at the end. Some people might think it should come first, but as I mentioned, it's only a means to end, and there's still quite some work to do about this. And finally, about non-policy tools too, I'd like to mention, because they're really moving forward right now. So it's really non-legislative. The so-called SBT and Science-Based Target Network, which is mirroring the process of the previous Climate Science-Based Target Initiative, and now developing similar science-based methodologies for nature, more precisely for land and for freshwater. Science-based target setting tools are being launched right now for companies, and the same will happen next year for also biodiversity and oceans, to better capture all the different types of biodiversity issues. And a second one led by the WWF is the development of a so-called biodiversity risk filter, which is helping companies to identify and screen their own biodiversity risks and help identify and mitigate these risks to prioritize action for biodiversity and for water. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Sébastien, for this very comprehensive overview to start. So now we will follow on with the second presentation, and we'll come back to some of the key issues and points you've raised during the discussion. So Now we'll pass it on to Marion Haar. Will present us what's happening with the Task Force for Nature related financial disclosures.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Francois. Are you doing slides from your end? Yeah.
Yes, we do have them on the screen. So tell us when we need to turn.
Okay.
Please.
Yeah, just to let you know, I think it was the end slide was just from the previous speaker, a perfect segue, because this is exactly around a voluntary market-based framework, the TNFD, so the Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosures. So it's not a regulatory play at the moment. But next slide. So this is really to give you a quick flyover. What's going on, what's the content of the TNFD, and then looking much forward to the discussion to dive more into the detail. What you see on the slide, that's the logo of all the task force members. So we have both real economy corporates, we have insurers, we have financial service institutions, mainly in the public market category, the listed companies, and we are trying to have a complete global coverage. There are 40 members. Then we have built out at what we call a TNFD forum, which is really where you can also find regulators, science-based institutions, etc. But TNFD really set out on a journey back in June 2021, acting on a G7 mandate. And also when we were in Montreal last year for the adoption of the Global Biodiversity Convention, a lot of the policymakers were very hopefully referencing TNFD as the framework that will come and help guide them on what are they supposed to require from real economy corporates and FIs when they need to disclose, and they need to disclose on target 15 once those become nationally implemented. But we set out on a journey, which you see on the slide, really to design a risk, impact, and opportunity management framework. So we are not only asking companies and FIs to disclose on their nature-related risks, but also on the opportunity side, which you also have in the taxonomies, but really also the opportunities for transition and really the opportunities to shift the trillions of dollars that we also heard Francois say in the beginning, referencing the State of Nature report from UNEP, that we need to shift to in order to create nature positive outcomes. But as you see on the slide on this staircase, we designed this process not as a sort of normal standard setting process where you have more either policy or regulatory driven or science-based science driven, but really as an open innovation process, crowding in as many perspectives as possible. And that's because we want to design the TNFD not for the market and come to present something, but really with the market and with science, and to create something which is scientifically informed, but still practical and implementable. And I think that's the most difficult balance for us to strike in the nature space, which is highly complex, as you know. So, but for us, it's not only about disclosing the right information to the market. It's really also about having the mindset and capabilities across the financial service institutions for companies to scale what most of them do at a very small scale today to a much larger scale tomorrow. Next slide, please. So really what you find if you go onto the TNFD website and sort of the building blocks of the architecture are these boxes you see on the slide. So at the bottom, we have core concepts and definitions of nature and what language do you need to engage with in order to disclose. Then we have metrics and targets, where we also heard in the previous presentation on more regulatory metrics, but we have TNFD metrics. Then we have how-to guidance. And that's because the market has constantly said to us, don't just give us what you need us to disclose, but give us how we actually get there. Nature is a completely new topic. It's complex. We need to engage with it. So give us some how-to guidance. And then on the top bar, you see we have the TCFD aligned disclosure recommendations. Next slide, please. So just to give you sort of a quick overview of where we are with the concepts and definitions that we have designed. And this is, and I completely recognize that this is an overwhelming slide, so don't try to read everything on it. And but we call these the concepts and definitions of nature, and the TNFD recommends that market participants use these concepts in their disclosures. We also sometimes joke that this is the periodic table of nature, but the intention is really to provide the market participants with a set of fundamental concepts and definitions to start to engage with this topic as a language system for action. And this was really a response to the fact that we have received so much feedback from market participants that we need the TNFD to offer a set of concepts and definitions, just as we have it for climate. On climate, we have concepts such as net zero, emissions, carbon budgets, parts per million, carbon equivalent, and we have a whole set of terms that we are familiar with, and that enables us to compare asset climate performance at market level against each other, which we currently do not have on nature. And also to just say that the reason we picked up this language and not another set of concepts and definitions is that we are aligning to the UN system for ecosystem accounting and their statistical standard, which is going to be applied by all states for their national ecosystem accounts when they implement the global biodiversity framework. So we want to harmonize with that standard to make sure that the data companies and FIs need is with time going to be available. So I only want to draw your attention to, on this slide, some of the key concepts that we use. 3 of them, we use realms, ecosystem services, and impact drivers. For realms, that's the major components of the natural world, which inhibits fundamental differences of how they function. So they can further be broken down into biomes, where one of the biomes would be tropical forest. The second concept is ecosystem services, and that's a service that's provided by an ecosystem, and that is an input into production such as fresh water or into, for instance, a farmer production process, and hence it shapes also or impacts the underlying value of the asset or the business model. And the third element, which is key, because that's also reflected in the metrics that we require to the market, that's the 5 impact drivers that you see on the side of the slide. And these has been identified by science to be the main drivers of nature loss. And that's the ones you also find in the global biodiversity framework and all the policy goals that the countries are going to respond to. But here you see them on the slide, and you will meet them again later on in our metrics. So next slide, please, which is our TNFD disclosure recommendations. So basically, these are the recommendations that companies, if they are going to do TNFD aligned disclosure statements, that they need to reply to these 14 disclosure questions. They are designed to mirror the TCFD disclosure framework so that companies and FIs are incentivized to do integrated TCFD, TNFD, so both nature and climate related disclosures. We have just added in a few additional disclosure requirements because nature behaves in some ways that are different. Especially, we have one disclosure recommendation, which is that a company or an FI needs to disclose their approach to localizing where they source their ingredients from. So because of the fact that localization and nature loss is geolocation specific, so it's very different impacts whether you finance a square kilometer of deforestation in Brazil versus in Finland. So that's the biggest difference. Next slide, please. And then, as I said, we have also responded to feedback from the market, not only to design the 14 disclosure recommendations of what to disclose, but also to design a how-to guide. And our how-to guide is called the LEAP approach. It's a 4-phase approach of locate, evaluate, assess, and prepare. So the first step is that you need, as a business or an FI, you need to locate your interface with nature. And then you need to assess where are you locating or financing activities in low integrity ecosystems. And then that's where you focus. And then you do your evaluate, so you figure out which are our material impacts and dependencies. Then you go to translate your impacts and dependencies into risks and opportunities for your business and or for society. And then you prepare to disclose. And we have made different approaches, whether you're a financial service institution or a real economy corporates, because we are aware of that if you are an asset manager or asset owner with a large complex portfolio, of course, knowing where each company operates is very different, or very difficult. So you can, as an FI, actually start with your sectors and figure out which sectors are most exposed to nature-related risks. Next slide, please. And this is the last slide. This is really just to give you a glimpse into the the metrics that we call the core global metrics of the TNFD framework. So that means if you are an FI or a real economy corporate and you are to do a TNFD aligned disclosure, you need to, as a minimum, disclose on these 4 nature-related risk metrics, 1 nature-related opportunity metric, and 10 impact driver metrics. And these, if you see the ones that are the nature-related risk and opportunity metrics, which is basically proportion of total revenue or assets, if it's for FIs that are exposed to physical and transition risk, these very much mirror what has come out of the regulatory environment. So if you look at the taxonomy regulation, it's very much aligned with that. And then for the impact drivers, we have aligned it with what's in the global biodiversity framework, because we do expect that the countries will make their national implementation plans where they will set targets around these impact drivers and will also therefore require under target 15 for FIs and real economy corporates to disclose on these. And just to let you know, our hearing on these metrics is closing on Thursday. So please do go in on our platform and put in all your feedback that you have. We would love to hear that and discuss that further with you. And with that, thank you so much. Looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, thank you very much, Marianne, for this very insightful presentation about where TNFD is and going. And now we'll go to the third intervention, will be Jessica Smith, Nature Lead at UNEP FI. So we're going to share the slides.
Thank you so much. And my presentation actually flows very naturally from the previous one. So the UNEP Finance Initiative, we convene the banking, insurance, and investment sectors with the values and approach of the UN. So we have banking membership of more than 330 banks representing more than half the world's banking assets. And our insurance membership is a similar proportion. And then we work with the leading edge of the 5,000 Principles for Responsible Investment signatories in something called the Investment Leadership Program. So I have been leading work on nature, and the strategies that we use are effectively around the idea of portfolio alignment. So we've been preparing our membership to get ready for the goals and targets that are in the Global Biodiversity Framework and to align their entire portfolios in the way that they've been moving towards aligning their portfolios to a 1.5 degree target within the Paris Climate Agreement. Then another piece of work, the approach has been around assessment and disclosure of nature-related risks. So we were one of the 4 organizations with Global Canopy, where Marianne works, who originally set up the TNFD and now have been supporting it, particularly through financial institution piloting. We also have a tool with Global Canopy and another partner, UNEP WCMC, called Encore, exploring natural capital risks, opportunities, and exposure, which is used by both commercial financial institutions, but also central banks and financial supervisors. And then finally, we've been working to mainstream action. So this is a lot of capacity building, outreach, efforts within our industry platforms to ensure that all of the industries are acting in accordance with the goals and targets of the Global Biodiversity Framework. So since that was happily agreed in December last year, we've published a guide for investors called Stepping Up, and then now one for banks called Banking on Nature, and then a further one for insurance will be launched in the next few weeks. So if you just visit UNEP FI, the nature theme, there's quite a number of resources, including those 3, which are geared to our 3 industry platforms. So in general, UNEP FI works on voluntary efforts from the private sector, but part of our theory of change is also giving confidence to financial supervisors, regulators, and other types of policymakers about what the finance sector is ready for, and also demonstrating proof of concept that can inspire supervision. So our strategy is effectively around individual financial institutions, but also systems change for the entire financial sector. working hand in hand with regulators and supervisors. And we did have a colleague who was seconded to the EEC to work on the SFDR in the last year, which is now our global policy lead. So I wanted to just go on to the next slide and raise a topic that I think came out very strongly in the global biodiversity framework, but I would say it's one that's fairly new for the financial sector. I would also say it's one that's building on the lessons and shortcomings of climate finance. So, we know that human beings play an important role in managing ecosystems, and particularly indigenous peoples. So quite a number of studies are emerging showing that indigenous peoples are managing land and seascapes sometimes better than state protected areas set up for conservation of nature, and that high biodiversity is particularly coming from indigenous people's food systems. So, I think that this is a topic that, has, in some senses, always been on the intergovernmental agenda, but it really escalated. And we found that indigenous peoples and local communities are mentioned 18 times as, extremely important stewards of nature. And it's one that, it's groups that are often treated in terms of the risk side, the social risk in financial institutions, and sometimes as beneficiaries. But here we see that indigenous peoples and local communities are actors in creating these ecosystem services and maintaining this globally valuable biodiversity, but are only currently capturing a very small fraction of the financial flows that are for that purpose. So this is a topic that crosses in many financial institutions: climate, social, nature, financial inclusion it could be as well. And so it's one that we're working particularly within the Biodiversity Credits Alliance, and we will be publishing something shortly that really makes investors more aware of how indigenous peoples are already rights holders within international jurisprudence, and how financial institutions can work more closely as just partners to these stewards of nature. And this is, I think, a new way of thinking. I also want to mention that the ideas around the global biodiversity framework are about rewiring, the way that finance works, and how can finance operate in harmony with a biodiverse, nature positive future. And right now, a lot of our economic systems are extractive based, and we need to, we don't necessarily have clear transition models, but where we do have them, they should be celebrated, and we should learn from them. So I think it's a very exciting time if we can bring these ideas into the financial sector and change the way that we value nature, and make sure that those who are stewarding nature successfully are rewarded for that work that they're doing.
Thank you, Jessica. Great overview. And before we come back to this for a discussion, I will now pass it on to Arne for the last presentation, who will take us through what's happening on the data front. Investors and financial institutions need good data to take action. So Arne, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much. And hello and welcome everyone. Nice to talk to you today. And thank you for my great speakers before. I would like to talk about the complexities when we do biodiversity risk assessments. And as Marianne said, right, nature is complex. And maybe let me quickly explain you why it's really complex also for data providers like us, but also for companies to report on biodiversity. On the next slide, I think the question is really like, why is nature really that complex, right? And I guess everyone who knows climate change, I think climate change is complex, maybe because we should maybe have a look at nature complexities. I guess for different reasons, right? Because we still don't know that much about all the relationships in nature, right? And what happens in case a species disappears? What are the tipping points for the collapse of ecosystems? What is the nature budget, right, we have left? This is really hard to answer, really hard to measure. And for example, scientists that estimate that only 80% of all species are not yet discovered, right? So it's really complex, really difficult. at the same time, and that's maybe my main message, we should not really wait until we have the perfect solutions available, but work with what we have. Because in the end, it might be too late, right? If we wait for perfect solutions for investors. And what we do actually, also at MSCI, but also other people are doing, we look at biodiversity and nature from different kind of perspectives. One would be to what extent does a company impact biodiversity, but also to what extent does a company depend on biodiversity, and what types of risk does an investor or does a company face from the loss of nature and biodiversity. And maybe to explain a bit why is it so difficult, because even like an obvious maybe case, right? Think of a company that cutting down forests to convert it into a palm oil plantation. So we know that there was like a nature impact, right? But do we know how many species are affected? We only have proxies, right? Actually, an investor or a company would have to done like a kind of inventory of all living organisms, if it's animals, plants, fungi, microorganisms, right? Before and after that business activity, right? And we can't really do that. That's really difficult. We don't have the tools for that to collect the data. And we also don't really have a consensus of a metric, how to measure such a loss, right? Maybe you heard about the mean species abundance or the potentially disappeared fraction of species metric. This is something we could use, but it's also not like a market standard, and there are different approaches how to reach derive at those metrics. And even if we talk about more unknown territory, so basically about the oceans, for example, right? We still know so little about the deep sea, for instance, and the impacts of human activities on oceans, right? And also we see, apart from these more like model challenges, a lot of data limitations, especially if you think of supply chain data. Think of a food retailer with 10,000s of suppliers, right? It's really difficult to get and collect all those data, right? So really face obvious limitations and challenges when we want to assess biodiversity impacts, and even more if we look at basically nature dependencies, because how does a company, how does a portfolio depend on ecosystem services, right? Actually, we would need to add a price tag on every ecosystem service. You can see on the right side of the slide, from animal pollination, fertile soil, raw material supply, right, to assess the nature dependency in detail. Again, it's not really like consensus in the market how to do that, and also even not in the academic world. So that's really tricky. It could work for some case studies, but I think in light of all those complexities, it's really difficult and will always be difficult. So I guess the key question is, what should we do now? Should we wait for perfect solutions? Should we complain about data that is not really available or is lacking? I think we shouldn't do that, right? Because we don't have the time for that. And also, I think we have to be realistic that we might never have like perfect solutions available. So I think an answer would be, we should really work with what we have. We should be aware of the limitations and challenges we see, but we have a lot of proxies and a lot of data already that can be useful. And I'm also quite optimistic that we can further close the gap, thanks to companies reporting on that, thanks to the TNFD framework, of course, but also thanks to new technologies. Think of satellite images, remote sensing, geospatial data, and so on. So technology can surely help us, right, to report on to get better data. And for example, think of a new EU regulation on deforestation that will require companies to disclose the exact geolocations of their commodities that they have been sourced from. So potentially they could use some blockchain data, for instance, right? Or data based on blockchain technologies. So we can expect better data in the future and work with the proxies we have. But for sure, we have to invest a lot of more in like model development and to close the gap and to help investors to address biodiversity risks. Because on the next slide, you can see some important examples, right, of companies' requests. We actually have a lot of clients these days reaching out to us on biodiversity. We actually had more client meetings on the topic in the first quarter of this year than the entire last year, really reflecting this in uptake and interest of clients and different kind of perspectives, different kind of objectives. If it's like risk management, or is it like regulations, if it's like engagement, or to produce, or to create products or other kind of solutions, right? So actually a lot of interest from investors these days. And we see more and more actually demand also for specific products. On the next slide, you can see a quick overview of what kind of products we have available. And I think it's quite important to say, we have been looking at biodiversity actually since decades or years, right? But often we have done it from a more sector perspective. So what is, for example, to what extent is the food or the mining industry being affected by regulations, right? Or the chemical industry, how do they manage their impacts and risks? That's something which is part of our ESG rating model. But what we haven't done is actually like a kind of holistic assessment. To what extent does biodiversity affect sectors and companies, right? From a sector agnostic perspective. And this is something we will continue to do. Aside from our existing solutions, right? We also have on ESG controversy assessment, SDG alignment assessment, and so on. But again, the focus is really like to what extent does the company or like a portfolio is affected by biodiversity. And maybe just to provide an example, what we have done recently on the next slide is to show that we have launched our deforestation screening metrics, right? To help investors to identify basically companies that could contribute to forest loss. This could be by the production or use of commodities that are drivers for forest loss, or if a company has presence in high-risk operations, right? Or last but not least, if a company has been involved to controversies related to forest loss. So that's something what we can do. And I talked about the example of a forest loss before, right? A company converting land into to a palm oil plantation, how to assess the potential impact. It's really difficult to assess that still, right? But I think such a tool we have launched can maybe quite be helpful to show investors where they should focus on, right? A kind of proxy solution. And what we can also do, of course, to further refine all these tools in the future with better data, with more granular assessments, such as biodiversity footprinting approaches. And so I think, yeah, the biodiversity journey has just begun, I would say, right? And many investors still face a lot of trouble and challenges, but I think there's great progress being made. And maybe last but not least, to show you like in a practical example, the results from the deforestation screening metrics on the final slide, right? We can see these are some numbers investors can work with, right? Right, to see, for example, that supply chain is like a key driver for biodiversity loss, right? Potential indirect contribution with a high share. So it's really important, right, to have a quite broad focus on biodiversity. And again, it shows, yeah, we have a lot of data, we have tools available. We face limitations, yes, but let's start with that and yeah, keep on further refining our products to help investors to drive change. Thank you.
Yeah. So thank you very much to the four speakers for the great presentations. So now we'll turn to discussion to rebound of some of the key ideas and points that have been shared during this presentation. So if I take stock of what happened in the last 50 minutes or so, so we started talking about the outputs we'd like to see. So when it comes to the financial sector, that means changing capital allocation. So more flows into, less flows into harmful activities to nature, more flows to areas like nature-based solutions, but also it's an output is about changing practices. So we've talked about that as well, but then following then during the discussion, based on those outputs, we looked at several inputs that we have today, or let's call it toolboxes. So regulation, what are the regulatory inputs that we've got to solve this problem? Market initiatives, practices, initiatives taken by the financial sector, as illustrated also with the presentation from UNEP-FI, and then data. Nourishing the system with more fact-based information, if not science-based data. So basically, I think for someone who's a bit new to this conversation, I'm taking a step back. I mean, we've seen like it's quite impressive. I mean, there's so much being put on the table. I mean, regulation, we saw with Sebastian's slides, it's very busy. Yeah, TNFD is also a huge framework, traction. Yeah, UNEP-FI is a huge network doing lots of great initiatives. And then also, as we saw with Arne, like we don't have yet perfect data, but there's so much primary data, ways to already analyze better what's happening from what we've been doing in the past. So honestly, I mean, the question is, okay, so where does it fall between those inputs that we've got and reaching the outputs? And maybe I turn to you, Sebastian, initially saying, I mean, like, what do we need to take more action, go deeper in the financial system? So is it also involving maybe central banks, supervisory authorities, like going into the second layer of regulation? Also, we heard, I think, the great point about data. We cannot wait forever that we've got perfect data. We have like this window of opportunity now. So maybe, yeah, if you want to rebound.
Yeah, maybe 2 points in this. The first one is that if there is clearly an acceleration of initiatives on biodiversity, EU-wide and globally, which is very, very good. At the same time, there might be a reason for this, which is that there was so much procrastination in the last decades that now we come to a point where we have to accelerate because some companies and some sectors already start to feel the cost of biodiversity loss and ecosystem destruction, and also climate change impacting biodiversity negatively. Because remember, the 3 Rio conventions on climate change, on biodiversity, and also on deforestation were approved the very same day in 1992. So it's 31 years. It's 1 human generation. What did we do in 1 human generation on biodiversity? Very little positive, and mass destruction with the economic and financial systems, right? In the last 30 years, the damage we've done on biodiversity has skyrocketed, and today we destroy more biodiversity than ever in human history, right? And this is still accelerating. We are still not even slowing down the biodiversity damage that our global economic and financial system is doing on Earth. So we've come to a point where we have no choice because we are already going to the end of the window opportunity where it's possible to have a smooth, what experts call an orderly transition towards a nature-friendly economy. And we exiting this space because we've taken too much, we were too slow, and we are running out of time. And the risk is we will enter a space where we will have to take brutal decisions and impose disruption on the economy and on the financial system because we will have no choice anymore. And of course, this is very hard to do. This is politically more challenging, so it's less likely, it's more costly, it's less effective, etc. So that's a complete vicious circle. What is very clear is that we will need an integrated approach. That means a suite of many different solutions to manage this crisis, because biodiversity is a global issue, but also a local issue. This is more complex than climate change, as different people said. And so that means we need to integrate different things. I mentioned the different EU policy options and what is still to be done on EU regulatory, on EU regulation. The EU has taken the lead in terms of globally in terms of biodiversity regulation, at least on finance, but more will need to be done also outside Europe. There's also a wake-up call that is needed for the market. Different companies, different financial institutions can do a lot. Different tools were presented. TNFD is relevant. Science-based target network is relevant. Companies can report. Companies can set targets. Companies can, etc., can stop doing harmful practices because in many cases they already know they are harmful practices. So there's a lot that can be done, and there's also a need for awareness raising of all the types of stakeholders, consumers, citizens, but also policymakers. Critically, policymakers are just not there on biodiversity. They are just largely still missing the point. For example, take a very basic way to compare biodiversity and climate change. We know we need to change the economic and the financial systems to truly integrate biodiversity into these systems to ensure sustainability, right? Now, think if a policy decision on biodiversity is still taken by the Ministry of Finance, of the Ministry of Environment, that means this issue is still a niche issue. If the decision is taken by the Prime Minister or the head of state, you can consider this is mainstreamed in the system. And clearly for climate change, some big decisions are now taken by prime ministers or heads of states. For example, EU climate goals, EU climate targets for 2030, 2050. But for biodiversity, it's still taken by ministers of environment. That means, and biodiversity is still not mainstreamed, even policy-wise. And that's a huge failure. We all fail to make sure biodiversity is considered as seriously as climate change. It's still largely sidelined. So there are all these types of integrated actions to be done simultaneously to really change the system very fast, because there's a desperate urgency of this.
Thank you, Sébastien. And maybe, Marianne, I will turn to you the same type of question, but with a TNFD angle, and asking you, so you present a great framework. It looks very comprehensive, very well structured, but what are the incentives you see will enable this to travel where it needs to go? I mean, is it basically more regulatory incentives, or having good complementarity with the regulatory frameworks? Is it more data, or what are the things that needs to happen for TNFD to be a success?
Yeah, I think definitely what you said, Francois, regulation is key to drive incentives, and there definitely TNFD is striving to play that role. Since you also said, Francois, it's a very busy space, both in the voluntary and also in the compliant space, and we are really seeking to drive consistency, because of the fact that if you have a portfolio that has exposure across many geographies, currently you don't have a great consistency. You have regulatory fragmentation in this space. So we really try to inspire regulators and also standard setters such as GRI and ISSB to drive towards standardization. And really, when you talk about nature-related disclosures, that it's just going to focus on the same type of building blocks as dependencies, impacts, transition, and physical risks. So that regulatory piece, and as we heard before, also that needs to travel into central banking. It needs to be acknowledged that it's a financial stability risk, and thereby capital requirements should be differentiated as to different types of assets and their exposure to nature-related risks. So regulation is absolutely key as an incentive driver. Then, of course, also the transition risk driven by shift in consumer choices and preferences. We see massive shifts currently in the meat space, alternative proteins, for instance, that being something which is definitely going through an upward trend. So the whole sort of consumer shift that drives transition risks is very, very interesting. But of course, also when we have the national implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework, where hopefully we will have new types of payment for ecosystem services schemes, and we will have hopefully you will be rewarded by through biodiversity credits, etc., by having a lower footprint on biodiversity. But a number of the members in the TNFD task force, such as Rabobank, they already launched in 2021 their biodiversity-linked farmer credit to dairy farmers, linked to a set of KPIs, I think, identified or designed together with WWF, with the same logic as in climate-related credits, where you get a interest rate rebate on certain performance criteria, where you lower your impact or negative pressure on biodiversity. So I think definitely the financial sector holds a key role because of the fact that they want to get that risk off their balance sheet, and thereby reward lower biodiversity footprints. And then we haven't seen that much in terms of financial innovation yet in this space. I mean, we've seen a few sort of biodiversity screened ETFs, but that is mainly just screening out the really bad ones. So it's not really transitioning. It's mainly currently still in the venture market, where we see exactly alternative protein type companies, alternative feed to fisheries companies, etc. It's still quite niche and it's still quite small. So we would like to see more incentives going in that way in terms of also new types of special funds. So I'll stop here.
Yeah, thank you very much, Maureen. And just pausing here before going to the other panelists, but just I'm on the linkage now between regulation and then TNFD. So within TNFD, a big part for the organizations will be to assess transition risks. And a large part of transition risk actually is to create expectations about future regulation. So it's a bit like of a circular loop, if you see what I mean, like in terms of, okay, when do the financial sector starts to take potential regulatory signals seriously? Because if you look at, for instance, monetary policy, I mean, soon after there will be policy views expressed about interest rates, or I mean, this will be digested, if not instantaneously, very, very quickly by the financial markets, will be actually reflected in the credit markets. But it seems like with biodiversity, maybe there is this link today missing in terms of regulation. There's this expectation of regulation that's taken more seriously.
I can try to answer that with two examples. One is the file called CSDDD, corporate due diligence, and the other one is capital requirements, prudential rules for banks or for insurers. They are currently being negotiated by EU policymakers. And to make things simple, what is the mainstream financial sector, that means the main financial lobbies at EU level, doing on these two files? They're pressuring policymakers like hell to make sure these two files will not require them to take biodiversity risks into account. For example, the financial sector is lobbying extremely hard at the parliament right now, just before the plenary vote, so that the financial sector is completely excluded from the corporate sustainability due diligence directive. That's what they're doing. So they're not taking it responsibly at all. There are only a few financial institutions and groups courageously having a dissident voice and saying, we want our sector to be included in this directive so that we will have due diligence obligations to identify and mitigate our sustainability and specifically our biodiversity impacts. But in general, what the mainstream financial lobbies are doing is to try to be excluded from such an obligation. And actually, it's the same with the prudential rules. The banking lobbies, the mainstream banking lobbies, so that means the bulk of them, not 100% of the banks, but the bulk of the main lobbies, are also heavily trying to not have capital requirements that are taking climate risks into account. So basically, they're still having an extremely conservative approach about, we are the nice guys because we take voluntary, little wishy-washy commitments, especially on reporting, not much more. But for the mandatory elements, come back in 10 years when we will be sure to be too late for the 2030 targets and very likely the 2050 targets as well. So it's still totally irresponsible. And of course, this is where the policymakers should intervene and decide to regulate. And very frustratingly, policymakers are influenced by such lobbies, which are extremely powerful at EU level, at national level, etc. And we will see if they give up or not. But they already gave up with prudential rules on capital requirements. We will see if they give up on the inclusion of the financial sector for the corporate due diligence directive. In such a case, if the policymakers are failing to take action properly, hopefully the central bankers and the financial regulators will take action with the means they have. They have some room, they have some power and tools. However, until now, they've been failing to use them really fully and properly on biodiversity risk and other things. notably because they are lacking expertise and capacity on biodiversity-related financial risks, because they themselves have a mandate to control the supervised companies with many different things, not sustainability, but many financial issues. And so far, they have little expertise and capacity on sustainability risks in general and on biodiversity risk in particular.
Thank you, Sebastian. So, yeah, in a way, yes, the financial institutions understand, the weights of potential regulation, but then, yes, they need to basically, change practices and potentially embrace further the trend. So, before we go actually to talk about practices with Jessica from UNEP, I don't know if Marianne, you wanted to add anything on this. I mean, like, because also with TNFD, I mean, there also needs to be signals from the regulation in terms of transition within the industries which are invested, right? So not only regulation at the level of the financial sector, but also regulatory initiatives impacting the invested sector, be it the marine transportation sector or renewable energy, etc. And how does that get embedded within TNFD? Do you see this as a big driver or?
Yeah, we have gone very sector specific in the TNFD. So what I showed you on the slide with the global cross-sector metrics, but actually there are for the most exposed sectors, we have then specified either of the metric to the sectors. So we started with food, of course, as the most exposed. So there we have specific metrics, and there you can see it becomes much more, that's where the rubber really hits the road in terms of both physical and transition risk. I mean, just see what's happening in the Netherlands in terms of the fact that, you know, you have stranded farms on high nitrogen concentration land that is completely stranded assets. So there you can see it becomes very, very real. And also just the farm to fork policy in terms of all the limits it introduces to nutrients and also to pesticides. So that's transition risk on the balance sheet, at least in the EU, that's approaching very rapidly. I do think for, like we just heard before, that also on the deforestation-free commodity directive in the EU, that's going to be opened for discussion of whether FI should be included in 2 years. So I think some of the same logic is applying, that currently it's for that biome, it's completely free for the finance sector to finance deforestation, or almost completely free, not from a reputational perspective, but from a transition risk perspective. But I think that's coming. But I agree with you, Francois, it's much more real when you get to the sector regulation, the sector-specific regulation on impact drivers, which introduces physical risks. And that's the information that we, through the TNFD, by making the disclosure sector-specific, want to drive into the financial markets, because otherwise, if you get these very aggregate metric that a corporate has this part of the balance sheet exposed to physical and transition risk, it's almost information that you can't act on. So that's, I completely agree with you that it's the sector level that is going to drive a lot of the risk and the capital reallocation.
Thank you, Marianne, for this adding this perspective. And now, I mean, going back to the topic of having to change practices within the financial sector, seeing concrete changes being enacted. I don't know if Jessica, from the UNEP FI perspective, with the great network you have, if you can tell us about where you see the next steps really to drive this forward.
Well, certainly within our financial institutions, you know, most of them have made portfolio-wide climate commitments. And we have Target 8 in the Global Biodiversity Framework that connects to nature-based solutions. But in general, our approach is that, you know, the screening of the harmful flows is much, much more urgent than creating new financial opportunities for nature. So we want to really stem harm, and we have recommended exclusions, so financial exclusions of activities, for example, deep seabed mining, which are simply not part of a green economy or a blue economy. I would say there is a challenge in the sense that with the climate issue, there are revenue streams and there are other, economic activities that are available for transition. And we really struggle, with many types of nature-based revenue streams in terms of the timing and the speed, and connecting to those markets where those nature-related revenue streams can come from. Also, in terms of the moral questions around financializing nature, which are very justified questions. There was a paper today by Dilys Rowe and colleagues in the journal Nature calling for loss and damage finance related to biodiversity. So, I think it's important to look at the private financial sector, but it's only one piece of all of the parts that we need to finance nature sustainably and meet the 2030 goals and targets, which are really, really rapidly approaching. In terms of I agree, voluntary initiatives are great, and they're never going to be enough, and there certainly needs to be a Eric Usher, the head of UNEP-FI, has called it a dance between regulators, the private sector, in order to try to feel where the needle is. But it's very hard for a commercial financial institution to go further than regulators and society is calling on them to do. So, if for example, our financial institutions started to tank because they withdrew financing from harbor flows but didn't have anywhere to put it, considering also last year sustainability related investments performed much worse than oil and gas, we would have backlash. So I think that there just needs to be a very careful conversation between the parties involved, with a lot of transparency and scrutiny from society of how far and how fast can we move private finance. And to me, the risk arguments are always the most compelling, because it's part and parcel, risk management, risk transfer is part of what the financial sector is there to do. So I've always found those, more compelling than, arguments towards impact.
Thank you, Jessica. So I guess maybe we'll have some open questions to react on the speakers and the last part of the discussion. Before we do this, Arne, as the fourth speaker, maybe just a question to rebound also on your presentation on data. So yes, we heard you saying we cannot wait for perfect data to move on. I often hear these days people saying, what gets measured gets done. So we still need data. So in a way, how do we solve this issue that, we need to work with, call it imperfect data, but then make it actionable as quickly as possible for the finance sector to, start taking action?
Yeah, I guess what is always quite helpful, like if there's some more guidance for investors, if it's like from regulators, right? Also like from TNFD or other initiatives, right, to help them. But in the end, I think there needs to be more consensus, right, how we measure biodiversity risk. And to some extent, I see some movement here. Because in the end, right, it might not be helpful if every client has its own approach, how to, as you talk about his or her risk, right, when you talk about nature and biodiversity. So it's a bit tricky. And also with conversations with clients we're having these days, I think these are often to some extent also a bit lost, right? We first have ESG, then we had climate change, complex topic, then another super complex topic. And looking often at the investment teams in financial institutions, right? They are quite small. You need a lot of expertise to do it right? So that's certainly like a challenge for them. It shouldn't be an excuse, right? And at the same time, any kind of guidance is helpful. Any kind of harmonization is quite helpful, right? For climate change, we have that more or less, right? We have good scenario, we have metrics, we have tools, at least, more or less, right? And this is really helpful. And so in this respect, I think I really appreciate what the TNFD has done, right? And could be helpful also see what the European Union has been doing right on that. So that's, I think, good. And I see maybe some companies might be front runners and with sophisticated solutions. But in the end, it's also quite important, right, to focus, of course, on the risk side of things, but really to get the financial markets on board to really also talk about opportunities we see, right? And this is, I think, really crucial, right? Otherwise, if it's only like a risk topic, maybe investors are a bit scared away. But if you also focus on the opportunity side of things, that's a maybe big thing. And was maybe actually quite good because there's a lot of anti-ESG movement, right, in the States, for example, also more skepticism about greenwashing. At the same time, I think climate change is always this more kind of abstract topic to some extent, which will materialize more in the future. While I think nature and biodiversity is something I think even many investors who are a bit anti-ESG could relate to, right? Important to protect the local forests, protect the beautiful creatures on our planet, right? So to some extent, it's a topic I think many people can relate to in a more direct way than to climate change. So that's maybe also kind of opportunity we see, right? Maybe, yeah, something I spotted in conversations with especially US American investors these days.
Thank you, Arne. So, yeah, now we enter the last 10 minutes of this session. Usually, so what we do is we open the session to questions from participants, either online or those in the room. Unless there was any final points that any of the speakers would like to make before, or any final reactions before we open for questions. No. So I think we stopped the recording now. We're entering the open discussion session. Thank you. So I don't know if anyone in the room would like to start. Start with a question. We've exposed you with a lot of complexity. I don't know if you survived so far, but yes, so much happening. But where do you see the priorities? Well,